Alright, let's talk steering. Let's do it the right way this time. This is a 14-inch rack and pinion. I got it on Amazon for $114. It's made by Latest Rage, but any 14-inch rack will work. Some of them have different steering ratios. I just picked the one with the lowest ratio. Now this is a 3/4 turn or 1.5 turn lock to lock, which means you have to turn the wheel 3/4 of the way around for full deflection of your wheels. It's the lowest ratio I could find, and it turned out to be just fine. With the live rear axle and all the power on tap, you're steering just as much as with the back end as the front. So, since this is a 14-inch rack, for bump steer, you have to align your steering pivot points in line with your A-arms. I'll give you a quick example of that. Alright, so you have your lower A-arm, and you have your upper A-arm, which is shorter than your lower A-arm. To cancel out bump steer, you need all 3 of these bolts in a line. That makes them all work on the same radius, and I like to make mine adjustable just to tune out any bump steer that. And secondly, since we're using ATV parts, these tie rods just came on the quad. This tie rod will not adapt to this heim joint. The bolt size is wrong, and this has its own pivot on it. So 2 pivots in a line would make the steering all wacky. So we need to custom make ends for this steering rack. Luckily, this is just threaded. So we need to make a C-clamp that goes around here, comes in here. Okay, so now we need to take a measurement to see how wide our rack needs to be. And it looks like we need about 17.5 inches. Should be pretty easy, I'll show you how. All right, to make this into an adjustable rack, you're gonna need some all thread and some 1-inch flat bar. Okay, we're gonna cut this into 3 pieces. We're gonna cut some holes in it. And we're gonna end up with something that looks like this. Tie rod's gonna go into here. You're gonna have pivot action and movement for your steering. Now this all thread right here is the length needed for the width of your A-arms. So we have 17.5. We need to add 2.5 inches, which is 1 3/4 per side. So this needs to be 1 3/4 longer than this bolt, minimum. Get ready for the time lapse. All right, next we're going to measure the clearance needed for our brackets. So from the center of the hole out to the end. So let's do it at 3/4 because this is going to be a fixed point. It can be pretty tight in there. Take your 1-inch flat bar. For an M10 bolt, you know I like to do 5/8 to the center of the hole and then 1/2 inch across because it's 1-inch flat bar. There's your punch carrot. 3/4 to the cutoff point, and that's 1/2 of our bracket. We can flip it to the other end, do the same measurement so we're only hitting the machines once. Okay, once you have that, you want to take your tabs, put it into your tie rod, get the bolt and tighten it up. Then you're going to take your 1-inch flat bar and measure how wide this needs to be. Now you just want to mark this directly in the center on all 4 sides. You want to cut it to the diameter of your all thread. Now once you have this piece made, you can either weld your all thread in there, or you can tack it to here and then do your all thread. I like to tack it first here, make sure it's squared, and then it gives me more meat to get that end welded on. Now you've got yourself a nice little bracket. So this is now going to go in here. It has clearance for some weld, and you are just going to basically drench this in weld inside and out. Alright, now that's going to be hot for a long time, but that's okay because we have to make another one. So while that's cooling off, we'll get our other one made. Alright, so now we've got our ends. We can put those on, but now we need to figure out how to mount this to the buggy itself. Now I like to have a strong attachment point because there's a lot of steering, there's a lot of energy being transmitted through the whole steering system when you hit a bump. We are mounting it to round bar. So I like to take 1-inch square bar, and I like to cut the ends off to make it a C channel. Then I'll drill the holes that match the holes for the mounting point, and you can see how nicely that fits on a round bar. Now you can adjust the height of it by trimming this up or down. You get a lot of weld area. And for your bolts, mine takes 7 millimeters. There is an American conversion for it, but the bike is pretty much metric, so I leave everything metric. You can take those bolts, slide them through the back side, clamp them to your rack, bolt them in. You can weld these bolts in place, and you will have a permanent mount for your rack that is perfectly centered, perfectly aligned, and all you have to worry about is the nuts and washers on top. Pretty slick little setup. Alright, we've got our bracket made. We can slide our 7 millimeter bolts in. And we can attach it to the rack. Look at how nice that is. It's just going to mount right on that bar, and you're going to have super solid steering. Now we just need to put the nuts on here, get it tightened up, and then we can weld the bolts in. Alright, now the final step to getting it in here is installing your steering mount crossbar. Just cut it to the width that you want of where you want to mount it, forward or back. Then you're going to mount this. Now the angle of this depends on if you're going to use 2 universal joints or a coupler with a second universal joint. Having it tilted back at an angle makes it a little easier that way, but if you put it straight up and add a second U-joint, it might give you some more pedal room. I marked the center line of the rack, and I marked the center line of the steering rack support cross member. So then it's just about lining those up, checking your clearance over here. Make sure your arms aren't going to hit your chassis at all. And then we'll adjust for bump steer after we get this mounted. But firstly, we want it centered. Alright, now this is just tacked in for now because we're going to revisit this and make sure all of our angles are correct before we mount the steering shaft and the steering wheel. So now we can address the bump steer. Now you want your rack centered, and you want to put this right between the mounting locations of the upper and lower A-arms. Now you can do a quick tie rod adjustment since we are using ATV parts. These tie rods are completely adjustable. They've got a left hand and a right hand thread. You just turn this and you can extend it out. Now also, the downside of using ATV parts is the steering arms coming off these hubs are facing the wrong way to get ackerman. These actually get what's called anti-ackerman, and what I do on my builds is I just run a little bit of toe out. So these wheels are going to be about a half a degree off center each to the outside. It makes turn in a little quicker, helps you get the back end loose at low speeds, and the anti-ackerman actually keeps it more stable for high-speed corner. Best of both, but remember, this is a $5,000 build. We're making a really fun, fast race car with $5,000. Now obviously this chassis, you can adapt any A-arms and any hubs that you want in this configuration. So if ackerman is important, you can get different hubs. So that's it, we have a full steering setup. Now you can do a quick check of your bump steer one of two ways. You can move the arms without moving the rack to see if the wheel moves, or you can move the arms without making the wheel move to see if the rack moves. I'll see how the rack moves in a little bit as I stroke through this. That means we have a little bit of bump steer. Now you can measure that and measure your bump steer, but we've made these adjustable. You have successfully tuned out bump steer. I know some of you guys might be wondering, hey Kyle, why don't you just put the rack and pinion, flip the hubs around and run it behind? Well, there's a simple reason for that. This is where your feet go. To put the rack behind means the steering shaft would go right where the brake pedal is. So this is unfortunately the only solution. It works out just fine. I've driven at low speed doing donuts. I've driven at high speed on tracks. This setup works just fine. Well, that's it for this one. Next one, we're going to have our own rear A-arms, mount the drive shafts, and we're getting closer to engine mounting time. So, thanks for watching. Appreciate it. All right, the steering's all done. It's mounted up nicely. It's nice and solid. It's just tacked in because, like I said, we're going to have to do some more work on it. Future plans, I already had this off of my second one, so I figured I would just finish this video up. I'm going to take everything back off of here, move it back to number 2, and maybe I'll do the wiring harness. It'll be jumping ahead a little bit, but it'll still be very good information. I've got parts coming in towards the middle of next week, so if my time lines up to get another build video in, I will certainly get that out for you.